Look at this piece of junk. Three teenagers laughed as they climbed onto the dusty green Jeep parked near the edge of the trailhead. They posed, shouted, snapped selfies like it was a joke. They didn't ask who owned it. They didn't see the boots by the tire. Until a shadow passed overhead and a drone hovered. Then slowly, silently, a folded flag dropped onto the windshield. Comment, silence fell fast, if this already stopped you cold. He didn't park there for attention. He parked for remembrance. Gerald Jerry Maddox, 78 years old, had been driving the same military surplus Jeep since 1976, a weathered CJ5 painted in faded olive drab that most people mistook for abandoned junk. Every Sunday without fail, he drove 20 miles west of town to an isolated overlook called Overwatch Ridge, where a small bronze plaque marked the spot where his training unit had lost 3 brothers during a flash flood in 1969. The ritual never changed. Park facing the ridge place, 3 smooth stones beneath the front tire. One for each fallen soldier, slip off his boots out of respect and sit quietly reading a letter he'd carried for 53 years. That particular Sunday morning started no differently. The autumn air was crisp, the ridge bathed in golden light, and Jerry had positioned himself a few yards away from the Jeep near the memorial plaque when he heard the distant roar of dirt bike engines. At the same moment, 3 teenagers on muddy ATVs pulled into the clearing, their machines kicking up dust clouds and disturbing the sacred silence Jerry had come to cherish. The first rider, a boy of maybe 17 with bleached hair and designer sunglasses, pointed excitedly at the Jeep. "Yo, check out that vintage war machine!" The second teen, slightly younger but equally brash, revved his engine as he dismounted. "No way that piece of rust actually runs. Bet it's just some movie prop someone abandoned up here." Without asking permission, without looking around for an owner, they climbed directly onto the vehicle, one perching on the dented hood, another swinging onto the roll bar like a playground monkey. They shouted, took photos with their phones, posed with exaggerated military salutes while making mocking faces at the camera. The third boy, the apparent ringleader, even began humming what he thought were military tunes, a ridiculous mixture of cartoon theme songs and half-remembered movie soundtracks. "Bet the old guy who drove this bucket is 6 feet under by now." He laughed, slapping the windshield for emphasis. They were too busy performing for their social media feeds to notice the carefully placed stones by the tire. They missed the neatly folded jacket on the passenger seat. They completely ignored the worn combat boots positioned respectfully beside the vehicle. But someone else noticed everything. From his position near the memorial plaque, Jerry turned back toward his Jeep and saw the silhouettes of 3 strangers treating his sacred space like a playground attraction. He didn't yell, didn't rush toward them, didn't lose his temper. Instead, he pulled out a small, outdated flip phone from his jacket pocket, pressed and held a single button. Across the ridge, hidden behind thick brush and camouflaged by decades of careful maintenance, a black drone lifted silently from a military-style storage crate. This wasn't a toy store purchase. This was precision equipment operated by someone who understood the value of surveillance and the power of perfectly timed intervention. They mocked the machine, never understanding it was never just a machine. The drone rose above the tree line with mechanical precision, its rotors barely audible as it positioned itself directly above the Jeep, where the teenagers continued their disrespectful performance. "Is someone filming us with that thing?" the youngest asked, finally noticing the dark shape hovering overhead. The ringleader smirked, adjusting his position on the hood for a better camera angle. "Let them record. We look awesome on this old war junk." But then something unexpected happened. Without warning, perfectly folded American flag, crisp edges, precise triangular shape, the kind reserved for military funerals, dropped from the drone and landed softly on the Jeep's hood with the weight of absolute silence. All 3 teenagers froze. The flag sat there like a silent accusation, its red, white, and blue fabric stark against the dusty olive metal. The youngest boy whispered in a voice barely above a breath, That's not funny anymore." The flag seemed to carry its own gravity, pulling all mockery from the air and replacing it with something none of them had expected to encounter on a simple weekend ride. One reached hesitantly toward the fabric, his fingers inches away from touching something that suddenly felt sacred and untouchable. But before his fingertips could make contact, a calm voice cut through the clearing like a blade through silk. "Don't. Gerald Maddox stepped forward from behind the memorial plaque, moving with the measured pace of someone who had spent decades learning when silence carried more power than shouting. His voice was steady, unblinking, carrying the authority of earned respect rather than demanded attention. You don't touch that flag unless you understand what it means to carry one. The three boys backed away from the Jeep immediately, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. We didn't mean anything by it, one mumbled suddenly, unable to meet Jerry's eyes. You didn't think, Jerry replied quietly, and that's infinitely worse than meaning harm. He walked slowly to his Jeep, gently brushed accumulated dust from the hood with his bare hand, then lifted the flag with the reverence of someone who had performed this action too many times before. You want a selfie worth remembering, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. Here's one from 1968. 12 young men in this photo. Only 3 of us made it home. From the glove compartment, he withdrew a black and white photograph, edges worn from handling, showing a group of soldiers barely older than the teenagers now standing in uncomfortable silence. None of the boys laughed anymore. The youngest removed his sunglasses without being asked. The drone continued hovering overhead, a silent sentinel bearing witness to a lesson being delivered without raised voices or dramatic gestures. Just truth presented quietly, carrying more impact than any shouting match could achieve. The clearing had become a classroom, and 3 young men were receiving an education they hadn't expected to need. If you felt that flag drop like a thunderclap comment, remember the silence. Some moments are louder than words. They had arrived seeking entertainment. They departed carrying weight they weren't prepared to shoulder. Gerald Maddox sat down slowly on the Jeep's rear bumper, the folded flag resting carefully on his lap as the 3 teenagers stood around him in awkward formation. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before the youngest found courage to speak. "What is this place, sir?" He asked, his voice stripped of all earlier arrogance. Jerry pointed toward the ridge where the bronze memorial plaque caught the late morning sunlight. "We trained here in 1969, special operations preparation. One afternoon, a flash storm hit without warning. Mudslide came down faster than we could react." His voice remained steady, but his eyes focused on something beyond the present moment. "Buried 3 of my brothers under 6 feet of rock and debris. We dug with our bare hands with mess kits with anything we could find. But we couldn't dig fast enough." The weight of those words settled over the clearing like a heavy blanket. "So now I come back every Sunday, and I remember them properly." The second teenager, still holding his phone but no longer filming, asked quietly, "Why the drone, sir?" "Because people forgot what sacred ground looks like," Jerry replied without hesitation. "They see an empty clearing and think it's a playground. They see an old vehicle and think it's a prop." "Why did you drop the flag?" Gerald Maddox stared straight ahead, his weathered hands folding and unfolding the flag with practiced precision. "Because I've carried too many of these folded tight, and every single one represents someone who never got to come home and sit on their old Jeep." The silence that followed was profound and transformative. Then, without prompting, the youngest boy stepped forward. "We're sorry, sir, we really are." "Don't apologize to me," Jerry said firmly. "Do better. Every time you see something old, something worn, something that looks abandoned, ask yourself who carried it first. Ask who it belonged to. Ask what stories it holds." Something shifted in that moment. The ringleader, who had been silent since the flag dropped, walked to the memorial plaque and read the names engraved there. Then he knelt down and placed a smooth stone beside the front tire of the Jeep. "For them?" he asked simply. Jerry nodded. "For them." Without instructions or guidance, the other 2 followed suit, each finding a stone and adding it to the small memorial pile. By the time they prepared to leave, 5 stones lay in a careful row, 3 for the fallen soldiers and 2 more for lessons learned and respect earned. The drone followed their ATVs partway out of the clearing, then returned silently to its hidden base among the trees. Later that week, the youngest of the 3 posted on social media, "We screwed up today. Sat on a Jeep we thought was abandoned. A flag fell from the sky. We left with a lesson and 3 names we'll never forget." The post went viral within hours, shared by veterans and civilians alike, who recognized the power of quiet education over loud confrontation. The top comment, like thousands of times, read simply, "The flag doesn't need volume, it already speaks." And in that viral moment, three teenage pranksters became accidental ambassadors for respect, remembrance, and the understanding that some places are too sacred for selfies. He never raised his voice, but somehow the entire world heard him anyway. 2 months after the incident, a small metal sign appeared at Overwatch Ridge Memorial Site, in memory of those who trained here and those who never left. The sign wasn't funded by the city or installed by Park Services. It was purchased and placed by three anonymous young men and their fathers who had driven up together to understand what their sons had experienced. Jerry continued his Sunday visits, maintaining the same routine he'd followed for decades. But now every few weeks, a new folded flag would appear beside the memorial plaque left quietly by visitors who had heard the story, with a small stone placed on top to prevent it from blowing away. He never saw who brought these tributes, never caught the anonymous visitors in the act of remembrance. But he smiled every time he discovered them, because finally someone understood what silence was built for. The drone remained hidden in its camouflage case, ready but rarely needed. The three teenagers never returned to ride their ATVs in that clearing, but they did return on foot, quietly bringing friends who needed to understand the difference between sacred space and playground. Some machines run on fuel. Others run on memory, sacrifice, and names no one dares forget. Subscribe to Wounds and Honor if you believe some engines never stop serving, they just got quieter.